Coming up, we once again turn the page on a loss for the New York Football Giants and drive our focus towards week number 3 and the Cleveland Browns. Is Deshaun Watson still a quarterback in the NFL? It's hard to tell. But also, what do the snap counts out of week 2 tell us about Big Blue and the plan going forward? We dive in coming up next. Yes, my friends. It's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your host over here, Adam Armbrecht, over there, Andrew Makowitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise, and some of us are thinking about getting into those retirement communities where the aesthetics are chef's kiss.
Oh, if you saw all the porcelain dolls behind me, Adam, and all the things that you have to like dust off, you would love it. But for the listeners, I am moving, so things are a little bit in flux right now. The one important thing is we're here and we're ready to talk about Big Blue. We're going to turn the page away from last week with a couple of news and notes as we look forward to the Browns. But what's top of mind for you, Adam? Could it be anything Philadelphia related or Atlanta related? Like, what did you take away from the Monday night game?
Dude, listen, I mean, it's one of those things where actually what it made me think of, because I was watching this with my cousin and talking with him, and Andy, you had brought it up about after the Giants lost, where then you look over and the Cowboys lost, and they look, a little bit, they're kind of disheveled, and if you had won the game, you would have been 1-1, and Washington would have been 0-2, and then you turn around, and while it doesn't matter relative to what we think is going to happen for the Giants season, it's just that kind of little kick in the plums that if the Giants had had a kicker, if they had won that game against the Commanders, you turn around and with a, intense opportunity for the Eagles to make decisions down in the fourth quarter with under 2 minutes to go, flip the script. Atlanta, massive drive. Maybe Kirk Cousins' demise has been grossly overreported. And at least for one more week, the Giants would have been tied for second place in the division.
Tied for second.
No, they would have tied for first place.
It would have been tied for first place, and they'd be the only team with a division
win.
With a division win, so they would be basically leading by all the tiebreakers. Adam, that's what makes me so mad. Is it's not necessarily that in the grand scheme do we expect it to be the difference between the Giants making and missing the playoffs? No, but if this team can continue to win games, be competitive, be relevant, be around 500 around Thanksgiving, then all of a sudden you're saying, well, maybe if a couple things break the right way, if Philadelphia doesn't look as good as, if Philadelphia looks the same way they did against Atlanta last night, and Dallas looks the way that they did in their game against the Saints, where they got absolutely destroyed, all of a sudden you'd look and say, maybe things could be interesting as we get to the back half of the season. Now the Giants really have to dig themselves out of the hole, and they aren't going to be favored in a game, Adam, until that Carolina game that you mentioned over in Germany. What a product we're sending over to the German fans, by the way. The Carolina Panthers, with now Andy Dalton being the starter, is going to presumably be facing off against Daniel Jones if he still has the job, in Germany in a couple of weeks.
Remind me to touch back on that Carolina situation, because there's a question that I wanted to ask you. I don't think fans care about it, but I'm always a curious man by nature. We turn our attention, though, first and foremost, obviously, to the game ahead, an early look at the line for the Giants, who will be going to Cleveland to take on the Browns. We're going to talk a little bit about Deshaun Watson later on here as well. But Giants-Browns, we're talking about a plus 6.5 point spread for the Giants going on the road. The money line, plus 240, if that's kind of your dance. And then the over-under is a seismic 38.5 points, Andy. Where do you stand coming off of a game where, again, in theory, the New York Football Giants could have been a team that scored 26 points against the Washington Commanders? It wouldn't stack up the way the Bucs did the week prior, but we know Cleveland at least is a good defense. So when you see all of that information, does this feel like the old seesaw of the Giants season where week 3 is going to be another big old crack across the back of the head, regardless of this QB matchup that we'll touch on later?
No, I don't believe that, Adam.
My. But it's 6.5. It's plus 6.5 on the road, Andy.
Listen. What I think, this has to be a huge wake-up call for Shane Bowen, because we just talked about before the malpractice that the front office and general manager did by not having the kicker situation sorted out before the game. I could go ad nauseum. I could go into it. They didn't sign a kicker from the tryouts. They tried out 4 different kickers. Randy Bullock, one of your favorite guys, was one of the guys they toted out there again. Tanner Brown was another who just signed with the Rams practice squad. The Giants have not made a decision on any new kickers. It'll be even worse if they end up just
We got the
signing
kid
Jude.
down in the practice squad. I don't whatever.
Yeah,
Man.
well, but the whole
I'm not
point
gonna
is
get
like
bogged down in it. I just don't know what we're
if
doing.
they elevate Jude from the practice squad, then it's almost like, well, why didn't you just do this on Saturday? That's going to be my question. I don't want to derail the whole thing. We're moving past the kicker situation. It just still makes me so angry when we do these things
Yeah.
that like cost the team a win. But Adam, the Cleveland offense is not very good. The Cleveland
That's the
offense
rumor.
does not have Nick Chubb right now. The Cleveland offense does have Deshaun Watson, and their offense doesn't seem to be able to move the ball. And so when I just look at this at a very high level, I sit here and I say, this is an opportunity for Shane Bowen and his defense to fix everything that is wrong and get right against something like the Cleveland Browns offense. Remember, the Cleveland won last game against the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Jaguars were in the red zone like 8 times and could not come away with points. They just played terrible when it came to like situational football. The Cleveland offense just doesn't really do anything with Deshaun Watson. So here, the defense has to look themselves in the mirror. It starts with Bobby Okereke, obviously in the middle. It goes squarely to Dexter Lawrence, Brian Burns, and Kayvon Thibodeau to say, that was an embarrassment in terms of giving up the rush yards that you did. If we are going to take a stand somewhere, it is making sure that no matter what happens come Sunday, we are stopping the run and we are making Deshaun Watson try to throw the ball over our heads, which he has not been able to do since it feels like before the pandemic, Adam.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I'm not necessarily terrified of taking on before the pandemic. That was a good line from Andy there.
You like
I
that,
want to
right?
make a note of that. I'm going to
Thank
come
you.
back to that later. I'm not scared of playing against Deshaun Watson. But the one thing that you mentioned there too, and I think it matters. And like, listen, Shane Bowen does have to continue to get things figured out on that side of the ball. It doesn't help that McLeod went down with the injury, as we know, and that you also had Cordell Flott go down at the end of the last game in week 2 against the Commanders also. But like, I'll go back to the box score for that week 2 game against the Cleveland Browns and the Jaguars, where, yeah, you're like, oh, 13 points. And like you say, oh, they get down and they're a bunch, but they just can't put it through. So is that simply converting? And then all of a sudden the Giants look different? It's hard for me, one, to hold up. Now, this Vikings team, as we've also mentioned, they maybe are better than we realize. Maybe the defense is a little bit stronger this season than people thought coming into it. So now you go up against a really good defense again. I have to remind everybody that in that game, the Cleveland Browns had 9 tackles for a loss, 4 sacks, 5 pass deflections, and 7 QB hits. So it's not as if we're walking into a situation where you just say, and then you get down there and you convert. Now, again, holding up week 2 in the Commanders and saying all the opportunities you had to be successful and making history by scoring 3 touchdowns and then still losing a game, like, I get it, but I just don't think we have the sample size that's big enough yet to say that the Giants offense is X. There's some things we're going to talk about when it comes to the snap count, going to look at the offensive line as well, but I just don't think like we can say with certainty they just do this and they win football games. We know Devin Singletary has been playing well despite that fumble in week 2. We know Malik Nabers absolutely explodes and is now getting nominated for Offensive Player of the Week with 10 catches and, big explosive game for him. It's awesome. But we don't know if that's repeatable. Like, we don't know that it automatically just gets the box checked. Actually, Malik Nabers is going to face a difficult secondary to make hay against. It's going to be a good test for the rookie as well.
Yeah, Adam, listen, I think you and me are probably on the same page. I don't know what's going to be repeatable from that Giant offense. It was encouraging in week 2 that they
Yes,
looked better than
right,
they did
right.
in week 1. But to me, I'm like, how many field goals could win this game against the Cleveland Browns? Like, my mind goes to, if this defense plays better than they did in the last game, like, to me, I think that the defense needs to step up. And this game feels more like there's an opportunity for the defense to take a stand and say, we're not giving up a touchdown. Just get some points on the board and we're going to go win this game. That's at least my initial thoughts as we look at how the Cleveland offense just can't manufacture points the same way that they have previously.
No, and that's why coming up here in a second, let's go that layer deeper. 2 games down for Cleveland, 2 for the New York Football Giants. One quarterback that once upon a time was regarded as maybe the next evolution of the position in Deshaun Watson for many reasons on and millions of disgusting ones off the field. He has not become that player around the NFL. Can Daniel Jones go toe to toe? I think the big question we often ask is, can you win the QB battle? Well, coming up next, we'll debate if Daniel Jones can accomplish that for Big Blue on Sunday. All right, Andy. Sample sizes matter. That's all you can do is look back and say, hey, what did players do against the opposition? Now, the Jacksonville Jaguars have not been a perfect team to start their year. They don't have any wins, so that's a part of the problem. And they also took on the Cleveland Browns, did the Dallas Cowboys, who got absolutely torched defensively in their second week. So when you look at Cleveland, you see 17 points, you see 18 points, and then even more importantly, you go and you look at Deshaun Watson, and you see over these first two games, he has just a completion percentage of 58.2%. He's thrown for 355 yards, one touchdown, two interceptions, sacked 8 times. When you talk about getting right, if you're Shane Bowen, when you talk about looking at that QB matchup, do you I mean, are we in a place where the Giants defense is capable of taking advantage of a quarterback that doesn't quite know what he's doing right now? Because I can go look at a rookie in Jaden Daniels, who everyone's excited about, but he's a rookie, and he still put together a pretty darn solid game in week 2 against the Giants.
Yeah, I mean, look, Jaden Daniels did exactly what he needed to do. When in doubt, he ran and took off with his legs. That is part of his game. He has that athleticism to be able to get downfield and make those plays happen. There was a lot of dump passes. It didn't feel like he was stretching the field vertically, but he did everything that he needed to do to move the ball along. They didn't necessarily need to go deep passes because they were running the ball so efficiently, Adam. They were always in 2nd and 3s and 2nd and 4s where you don't need the 12-yard gain. You don't need to go 15 yards down the field. You can kind of dink and dunk. Deshaun Watson is just such a curious situation to me. It's just, you haven't seen great football. You've seen maybe a game or two here or there where you see flashes of the old one. It's almost funny how Deshaun Watson has all of those question marks, but his peak was much, much higher a few years ago. But Daniel Jones has some of those same question marks where you see inconsistency. You see just a lack of going through the progression and the reads. They're both at important inflection points for both of the organizations. And so for me, I look at Deshaun Watson and I say, the Giants defense has not looked great through 2 weeks. This has got to be what he's looking at, saying this could be a get right game for me. The Giants have to be looking at Deshaun Watson saying, we think that he might be the worst quarterback that we faced in the first 3 weeks, knowing how Sam Darnold looked against the 49ers and how Jaden Daniels looked over his 2 weeks in the league so far.
Yeah, and it's one of those things too, because as we bounce this thing back and forth, you go through, you start looking at some of these other key stats and flip it over to the defensive side where I say all those pressures and what Daniel Jones is going to be facing. Currently, right now, the Browns are 11th in the NFL in opponents, third down conversion percentage, allowing just 28.5%. So under 30% on third downs, which is obviously important. And given the fact that a year ago, they gave up almost 30% on third down. So, this defense, and that one is, 1.5%. Is that a big difference? Yeah, kind of is, because you're getting closer to like 2 out of 10 versus 3 out of 10 or whatever it ends up being when those opportunities come up. And it's one of the things that I ping pong back and forth here, because remember the stats coming in, I believe Washington was 2 for 8 in week 1 on third downs when they started the season, but then they went ahead and had a lot of success against the Giants in that regard. So it is funny right now. I think neither, if you said, pick a quarterback out of the lineup that you want to start in week 3, Daniel Jones and Deshaun Watson are not going to be behind that list. But I wonder if you try to navigate the way of who makes the least mistakes most, right? Like Daniel Jones in week 2, throw some touchdowns, don't throw interceptions, protect the football, use your legs when necessary. That can be a recipe for success. And I almost wonder if the thing working against the Browns and Deshaun Watson right now is that, in theory, he has the sample size of how good he can be in the league. So you're trying to do the things that you think you can do, whereas Daniel Jones is still very much living inside of a shell where he's like, I do not want to make any mistakes or any wrong moves or any wrong decisions, and being a little bit risk adverse and throwing 18 targets to your number one wideout and not worrying about spreading the ball around might be the better version of your offense right now, as opposed to Deshaun Watson, who feels like he should be capable of doing more.
Well, and you talk about Daniel Jones, and what we also saw from Deshaun Watson over the course of his career, we know what the highs of the high are. Daniel Jones was horrible in week 1. I think he was the second in expected points added. EPA is just like an advanced analytics stat. And then Daniel Jones bounced back. And in this last game, Daniel Jones was 4th among all quarterbacks in expected points added at 5.9. So he played significantly better. He went from looking like a bottom 5-ish quarterback in week 1 to a top 5 playing quarterback in week 2 in terms of how he played on the field. So at least you're encouraged in seeing most recently that Daniel Jones can do it if he has enough time and he trusts himself to let it go. Didn't you feel, Adam, that like the first game against the Vikings, it felt like he was in his own head and he was like trying to figure out where to go and he was afraid of making the mistake. I didn't feel like he felt that way against the Commanders. Now, it remains to be seen how good the Commanders defense ends up being, but like Daniel Jones would drop back and he would rip it, and all the advanced metrics show that he had a really good day. And so the question is, can he do that against a very good defense in the Browns and an elite top 5 defensive player in Myles Garrett? That is going to be the big question of how the Giants end up functioning on offense.
Yeah, it's just so hard to put stock into it. Again, I take nothing away from Jones because you went out, you performed well, you gave the Giants a chance to win a football game. But it is the Washington Commanders, a team that he normally has success against. It is a very bad defense. So it's just hard for me to overinflate that value there relative to who you played against. It really is. Show me in week 3, and then even against Dallas, who seems to be having some defensive issues. So, we may talk about it at the quarter mark, quote unquote, of the season now with 17 games. What do we see over a 4-game sample size where you face some good defenses, you face a bad defense, you face an average defense? Then all of a sudden, I think the results kind of come back to the mean. One last thing before we turn our attention over to snap count, which I think is an interesting, obviously, bend here, because I had a thought on Theo Johnson that got absolutely shredded after the fact when I looked at those numbers. But a reminder here, it's interesting for the success that the Giants have seemed to be able to have in the running game potentially here. Both these teams, 21st and then 22nd, 218 total yards for Cleveland on the ground, 203 over those first 2 games. Daniel Jones used his legs effectively, 5 for 30-plus yards rushing in that last game against Washington. But consistency kind of matters here and not finding yourself getting one-dimensional. I actually think it's the crutch for both of these teams. If you make them one-dimensional, then yeah, both defenses, I think, will at least be willing to take their chance against quarterbacks that have been known to struggle when it's all on them versus having balanced offenses. Oh, snap, Andy. Snap count. Coming out of week number 2 here, I said this about Theo Johnson. I made the statement in the reaction game of he played 60% of the reps, in week 1. Then he come back around. You're like, where the heck is the guy? All of a sudden, he's not a part of it anymore. Well, egg on my face. He played 61 reps in week 1, 86% of the snaps. He played 44 in week 2, 79% of the snaps. The reason why I was confused, he wasn't used at all. You never saw the guy involved in anything. Now, the one side of this is, we'll go through some of these other snap counts here. The one side of it is he's still dominating shares. So is there a belief that he can start to work into being a player that, when asked, can at least impact some pass blocking or run blocking at a reasonable level? Manhurts is still getting his share. Daniel Bellinger is falling off the map. I don't know what to expect outside of the fact that in week 2, you had such an advantage in the Malik Nabers matchup that it didn't matter that other guys may have been available or that Theo Johnson could have been utilized better. Are you encouraged by the 4th-round tight end, even if we're not seeing anything more than 4 targets in week 1 with 1 catch for 18 yards?
No, I am not encouraged, Adam.
Okay.
And part of it is because I am very biased and I have absolutely no idea why Daniel Bellinger can't get on the field anymore. What happened? Like, clearly this was a theme that a lot of
he played just 4 snaps, by the way, for 7% of the share on Sunday. So he played 16 snaps in week 1, 4 in week 2, 23 down to 7, and it's Chris Manhurts who saw his numbers spike up to 46% of the share.
It just doesn't make any sense. And a lot of the beat writers told us that this was going to be the case over preseason and training camp. And they said, don't be surprised if Daniel Bellinger is a surprise cut candidate. And you and I both scratched our heads and we're like, what are you talking about? Like, after Darren Waller retires, we're very thin at tight end. How is this going to happen? The team uses a later round pick on Theo Johnson, and now all of a sudden he is vaulted up into the guy that's leading snap shares at a significantly higher clip. There's not even a split between him and Bellinger, which I just can't understand what is happening. We talk about how Theo Johnson is a little bit more athletic. He can stretch the field vertically. He does feel like he could be an explosive playmaker, but if you're not going to use him in that regard, like how is he dominating the snaps and then not getting targeted at all? And to your point, you touched on it, and I think it's the most critical point here. Teams are going to start doubling Malik Nabers. Teams are going to say, we are not going to let that guy have 20 targets. It's just impossible. We want someone else to beat us. Let's have Theo Johnson beat us. Can he actually impact the game if he's going to get those snaps? Because, Adam, if he's not getting targeted and he's not making plays or he's not getting open or Daniel Jones isn't looking for him, then the whole middle of the field is all of a sudden suspect for the Giants. I have very big concerns about the snap count of Theo Johnson. I know that they kept him in on a lot of 12 personnel. I know they kept him in. Devin Singletary was running the ball really well, so they used him a lot as a blocker. But if you don't even have the threat of a tight end over the middle catching passes, like that is going to be a huge problem for the Giants moving forward.
Yeah, I agree with you if it's not going to be a threat. I disagree if the idea is that he's not going to get utilized in that way. Now, on the one hand, Daniel Bellinger, not the same model of tight end, but he's a fourth round tight end, had some confidence in him, and now it's waned. You draft another fourth round tight end because he's going to take over and be more of that athletic pass catcher. So I want to chalk it up to one of the themes that I'm struggling with, that from week to week now, we're just seeing the Giants, Brian Dable, the coaching staff kind of swing the pendulum on who's playing, who's not playing, who's getting starter reps, who's not. The fact that Theo Johnson is seeing consistent reps, I'm going to chalk that up to something we feel like we can hang our hat on as being a theme going forward. Like with Tyrone Tracy Jr., 15 reps in week 1, that's 21%. 12 reps in week 2, that's 21%. Okay, let's put you on the board for that being the number of reps that we can expect for you and maybe growing from there as well. Now, I didn't see any production out of either of those players over those snaps. So that is the thing that you're pointing to and saying needs to improve. But if I'm going to try to be excited about something, is that the young players are being trusted to be on the field. Now it's about turning it into some level of production as we work our way through. Coming back here on the other side, there's one really important piece that came out of week number 2. And frankly, out of the first 2 weeks of this season for the New York Football Giants, and it resigns across the offensive line. We'll get into that in just one moment. All right, here's the deal, Andy. Coming into the season, the Giants had rebuilt the offensive line. Andrew Thomas, John Runyon Jr., Illuminor. They go get Van Roten because all hell breaks loose. But then the big question about John Michael Schmitz. And he had some injuries in the offseason, had injuries in his rookie year. He's already 25 years old. He needed to step up. He needed to be an impact player and start to help anchor this line. Well, guess what? He had 100% pass block win rate in week 2 for the New York Football Giants. That matters in a massive way to me if we're talking about growth. He played to a 69.1 PFF grade, 63.9 in pass blocking, 69.5 in run blocking. We knew that he needed to start to show that he was deserving of that high draft pick and that he was the best center in the draft class and that he was going to be able to be a part of this rebuilt line. Thankfully, we're seeing that sample size. Big test coming up against Cleveland, but this is the best case, I think, scenario that we could have seen week over week because he and Van Roten were a couple of the guys you wanted to watch in run blocking. They didn't have enough of it in week 1, more balanced attack in week 2. It looks like John Michael Schmitz is very much going in the right direction.
That is such an encouraging stat. We talked about all the question marks that there have been, Adam. Like what to make of John Michael Schmitz? Obviously, he had the pedigree. He was another can't miss type prospect like Evan Neal was coming out of Alabama.
Yeah.
And because of what happened and what has happened to Evan Neal, I think Giant fans have turned around and said, oh no, is this happening again? Do we have another can't miss guy on the offensive line that we're going to set and forget that is all of a sudden going to fall by the wayside after his
that we will
season?
then forget? Yeah.
Yeah,
By the way,
yeah.
Mekhi Becton, for all the talk about it, Mekhi Becton is a starting guard for the Philadelphia Eagles after being drafted as a tackle by the New York Jets. And I think that's all the speculation we come to Evan Neal of what are you ever going to do with him? I said this from the start. He may play guard. I just don't think it's going to be for the Giants. It'll be somewhere else with another opportunity.
I mean, the Giants do at some point have to try him at guard. There's no ifs, ands, or buts around it. Like if you want to try to get any value out of it, you're either going to have to trade him or move him to guard because he can't play tackle in the league right now. But on the positive side of things, John Michael Schmitz did look great. I mean, that pass blocking grade is encouraging considering that was one of the biggest challenges early on for John Michael Schmitz when he was healthy last year. Was it felt like the strength of defensive fronts were kind of overwhelming John Michael Schmitz. And now maybe he's kind of easing himself into it. Maybe now with some cohesion across the entire offensive line, it makes John Michael Schmitz's job that easier. Just do your job. Don't worry about to the left or to the right. Everyone working in unison, but doing their job effectively. It is extremely encouraging to see that. this is what a competent offensive line looks like for the Giants. And they're able to run the ball effectively. For the first time in a while. And that's why, we talked off the show about whether or not we want to talk about Saquon Barkley. Listen, the holes that the offensive line is creating for Devin Singletary are significantly more frequent and significantly larger than whatever they were doing last season. And I think it's also because they're pass blocking effectively. The Giants are not one-dimensional right now because the offensive line can play that type of way. The Giants have a number one wide receiver on the outside, and the offensive line can play well. To me, it's just extremely encouraging to see JMS look the way that he did at the center position. They desperately need that because that feels like the one real question mark that has kind of been left. You look at Illuminor coming over. He was a free agent signing. You expect him to be at least replacement level. You look at John Runyon Jr. Obviously, he's another guy you felt okay about. Andrew Thomas, we know he's a Pro Bowl caliber, all pro level player. JMS is the one where you kind of sat here and said, if we don't see progression, the Giants are going to have to figure out something mid-season. It's encouraging to see what we have seen from him so far. You hope it can continue. It can continue against a guy like Myles Garrett, which is going to be a very, very tall order for that offensive line.
We're going to talk about PFF grades in more detail tomorrow on the episode, but you mentioned a guy like Van Roten and Illuminor specifically, just because of who he is. A little bit, you wonder about the speed rushers and the edge. In this last game for him, you're talking about a 58.2 overall, but most importantly, the 51.8 in run blocking grade, 63.2 in pass blocking. So he's holding up against the edge a little bit. You have to look on that for those running plays and finding that consistency. And just one other note, because we discussed him before I give my final interesting tidbits off of the snap count, is that Theo Johnson, who we talked about before, he was in for 12 pass blocking snaps, 78.2 PFF grade. So why is Daniel Bellinger not getting on the field? Because maybe you were an average kind of in two categories, pass catcher and also blocker. And if Theo Johnson shows capable of being respectable as a blocker, then you're always going to lean to him. And then you're going to want to trust a guy like Manhurts to give you that consistency when it comes to setting up the pass and the run game, frankly, as well. So interesting things to watch there. Finally, though, if I could, Andy, when we talk about the snap count, there's one other area that I think really matters. And we'll talk about this more throughout the week. But when you look at that secondary, okay, head scratcher, you drafted Drew Phillips. How come he only played 16 snaps and 29%? 92% of the snaps in week 2, 66 reps for him. Cordell Flott, we mentioned, we'll try to get updates around his injury and what he's looking like this week. He played 82%, 59 reps. Deonte Banks, 100% for the second straight week. But interestingly enough, Adoree Jackson, 19 in week 1, 14 in week 2. That's 35 to 19%. So whatever we think is going to happen here, and we saw more of Isaiah Simmons as well, but it looks like the Adoree Jackson, signing, which Andy said at the time, was more about trying to safeguard against some early struggles in the season. Hey, great news. It didn't matter. They're 0-2. But it looks like you would think that as these young players ramp themselves up, specifically as Cordell Flott, we hope, is okay on the injury, it seems like it was hedging there a little bit. I'm just elated to see that Drew Phillips was out there as much as he is, because you saw in week 1 flashes. He showed more of it in week 2, and it just feels like you hit on this player. So stop stealing from the fans and not giving them something to be excited about as the season is going the wrong direction.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. The Drew Phillips piece is the big takeaway. You had ESPN pundits like Ryan Clark that were like, that Drew Phillips, like, we were watching that game and he jumped off the tape. Like, and he does. He plays like his hair is on fire. Like, Adam, every time I see him, he's going a million miles an hour. Like, this is going to be the last snap he ever plays. And that sense of urgency is like contagious, right? Don't you feel like when I see him on the field, like I am excited to see him potentially make a play. He had a huge hit on Jaden Daniels. He feels like he wants to get up in the run game and use his physicality. They could really use a physical player like him. I am very encouraged by that. What I am not encouraged by is how Cordell Flott has played so far, especially on the outside. Why is he playing inside when you had him on the outside all season? Then why do you have him on the outside coming into week 2? Like, why are we doing this stuff where you talked about the pendulum swinging back and forth.
Oh, yeah.
This is exactly what I don't understand. Why can't we just put players in a position to be successful that they practiced in all offseason? So for me, I obviously want to see Cordell Flott on the outside. I want to see Drew Phillips in there on very specific passing situations. It's okay to have Isaiah Simmons come in for Drew Phillips, be either a QB spy for a guy like Deshaun Watson or Jaden Daniels. But like, it seems like it's pretty basic at this point that like Cordell Flott should be playing on the outside. Adoree Jackson should be behind him if Cordell Flott struggles. Andrew Phillips should be starting, and Isaiah Simmons should be coming in behind him. Unless there are injuries, how else should the Giants be lining up other than that? I mean, unless your eyes and my eyes are telling us differently than what's actually occurring, it seems like a no-brainer against the Cleveland Browns that should be the way that they should at least start the game out.
You better believe it, buddy. At the end of the day, only 3 players have played 100% of the snaps over the first 2 weeks of this season on the defensive side of the football. That is cornerback Deonte Banks, as you would expect. That is the middle of that defense in Bobby Okereke. And yeah, it's Tyler Nubin. 100% of the snaps playing at that safety position alongside Jason Pinnock. We're going to dive into these PFF grades and performances for everybody more tomorrow because I think we can see the growth. Now it's just about confirming whether or not this is buildable, where we need to say wins and losses. Yeah, it's going to be a grind here this season. But can we see definitive application of assets and making sure this team is actually building something while we're asking all the questions about the coaching staff, the GM, and everything else under the sun for the New York Football Giants?
As you mentioned, Adam, the one last thing, news and notes, snap count.
Oh, please.
Obviously, Devin Singletary dominated the snap counts at the running back position.
Yes.
Tyrone Tracy got 1 carry. Eric Gray didn't get on the field for a snap at running back. That is a little bit perplexing to me. Obviously, Singletary was running the ball well. That is something that I am going to have a keen eye on, is why do we draft Tyrone Tracy if we're not going to try to get him involved in the game, especially as a pass catcher? I highlighted that as a potential way for him to get on the field and make an impact. They didn't even look his way once. As we talked about before, as teams key in on guys like Malik Nabers, the Giants are going to have more contributors like Theo Johnson, like Tyrone Tracy Jr., for this offense to continue to be able to function. So when we look at the snap counts, don't be surprised if you see a different dispersion across the running back room as the Giants head to Cleveland on Sunday.
You better believe it, man. So much more to talk about, including our fantasy and our bets of the week and everything else that we'll cover as we work our way through. But as it stands right now, the Giants are massive road underdogs going to Cleveland in what, for whatever you want to take it as, has to be a must-win game for Big Blue. 0-2 and staring down the barrel of a very, very long season. We'll be back in all week breaking it down, not only on YouTube at One Giant Podcast, over on X at One Giant Podcast, at AMAC214, and at Adam Armbrecht, as well as on your podcast feeds. Be sure to get us in all those great ways and leave a glowing review if you so choose. But until next time, until the best times, as Andrew Makowitz would want, need, and demand that people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.